Thank you, Pauline. So, start. Mira Schende produced a large amount of works after she immigrated to Brazil in 1949, first to Porto Alegre and in 1953 to Sao Paulo, where she first started to work as an artist. In 1951, she was accepted to participate in the first Bienal de Sao Paulo. As an immigrant, she came to Brazil during an interesting artistic debate about abstraction, formalism, and its questioning through aspects as corporeality and subjectivity, and the negation of the positivistic objectivity of concrete abstraction. Within the concrete and neo-concrete movements during the 60s, language, its physical implication, and materiality became an important aspect, also due to collaborations of artists and writers like Ferreira Goulart and concrete poets at the Campos brothers, who promoted visual poetry within the characteristics of concrete and neo-concrete movements. The movement presented a fertile ground for Mira Schende, although she never was part of one of them. Since 1963, language and writing became a major concern for Schende and an important instrument of her work. Within her work, she implied a changed understanding and application of language in comparison to the classical representation systems of things and its meaning itself in words. The unstable, mutable meaning of language within the world and subjective experience form an artistic language at that time. For the first time, I saw Mira Schende's work in the exposition Tangled Alphabets, held at the Museo Nacional Centro de Arte Sofia in Madrid in 2009, combined with the retrospective of the work of the Argentinian artist Leon Ferrari. I had to write a small comment on the exhibition at the time. The huge amount of works consisting of scrawls, lines, and signs on white, translucent, transparent paper or acrylic glass and directly exhibited in the exhibition space was just one part of the exhibition, encompassed with the other earlier and later works of the two artists. My excitement about the labyrinth of words, lines, and lines was replaced by the question of assembling the works of these two artists who had nothing in common but formal analogies. And I will refer to this later on. The main focus of my contribution today will be the implication of language in the work of Mira Schende and the current discourse on its ambivalent meaning to define modeling proportions of the proposed referential systems of word and image. As an outlook, hence, I refer to the use of language in its phenomenological scope and general description in the Brazilian context, and little beyond, you will see. With these modes of incorporating language, written text passages, words, and single letters, Mira Schende defined the dense meaning of her work. Aspects as spatial and temporal reception and translation of lived experience to the spectator, or reader in this case, through transferring it into the objectivity of language and making it a proposition to a visual and temporal experience. Schende used barely discernible words, half-obliterated phrases, and letters removed from the linguistic context or functional purpose. Its reception and theoretical understanding has changed since I saw the exposition in 2009, from a more formalistic discussion to the concentration on philosophical models the artists used in order to implicate language as the main aspect of the work. Mira Schende deals with language in its visual representation as writing in two ways. On the one hand, as a semantic sequence of signs referring to verbal representation systems that allows the spectator or reader the reading. On the other hand, she uses fragments of words, alphabetic signs, or structures which only remind of legible writing through the gesture of the line. In the monotypias, she worked with lines, writings, and text fragments put in the monotyping technique onto fine, lightly transparent rice paper. Sometimes they are legible handwriting, sometimes combinations of abstract lines. In this work, she transformed subjective experience, for example, through the expressions like time, beauty, or the void of the world, or text fragments from poems, songs, and philosophical texts, and so on and so forth, in the objective field of language. For example, time, Zeit, in the middle, is understood as the concept or the main understanding of time in a certain society. Though there's nothing lexical, steady, and constant about them, they are gestural propositions whose meaning comes into being only through the experience of the spectator or reader. In the gesture of the line, drawing, form, scale, and the density of the writings, emotional propositions, as for example happiness, excitement, or thoughtfulness, are proposed as possible meanings. Like in the two examples, Henri and Zeit, the kind of how the words are written and positioned determines its meaning, comparable with the strategy in visual poetry. The word Zeit, time, presents only an implicit cultural, predetermined linear time concept. But with that, the subjective perception of time, too. The empty space of the rice paper acts as counterpart, the non-verbal void, an empty space of possibilities. The monotypias present, through the absorption of the transparent paper and temporal implications of semiotic, symbolic different layers of meaning, and the simultaneous reception, for example, the time of the experience and time of the reading, and within the historical change of the meaning of the thing. The legible words, text passages, and their semantic function provide a plurality of temporal levels that led the artists during the 1960s to the so-called issue of temporality, problema de temporalidade in Portuguese. These thoughts resulted in the deconstruction of language into its elements and negation of the temporality of verbal expressions and rigid linguistic representations codes. The intimacy of handwriting was often replaced by the use of letter set. The use of transparency got new forms by the usage of actual glass, giving more liberty to the spectator by simultaneous multifocal reception. Mira Schendel stated on the imitation of time, I quote, "A second problem is the fact that a set of characters on paper imitate time, though it cannot actually represent it. The scribbles denote but do not immortalize the fluidity of time. For this reason, I have quit trying." And further on, acrylic actually offered me a fantastic opportunity to materialize an idea, the idea of doing away with front and back, before and after, and so on, while presenting a more or less debatable notion of simultaneity, the issue of temporality, so on and so forth, the spatio-temporality issue, etc., etc. The so-called cadernos, the notebooks, like other theories of that time, are the enhancement of this idea of materiality. Language is reduced to its basic parts. Letter-set letters, as visual entities, are positioned in different amounts and compositions on the transparent paper. The letters have their meaning in the visual presence as the reference to language as its smallest parts without any narratives. Horacio Moral described the cadernos in 1971 as comparable to Wittgenstein's language games. According to this analogy, They are never ready entities having their mutable meaning in the different use of in various activities of human life. In that context, the Druginias and Tresinho, these two series shown here, can be seen at the most radical position in her body of work. The Druginias are malleable sculptures of twisted and knotted rice paper. The Tresinho series of similarly experimental sculpture works consist of a cotton thread onto which blank sheets of rice paper had been threaded. The medium of the paper becomes an ephemeral, moving sculpture in the exhibition space. Not the materiality of language, but the absence of all language, the empty sheets, are an important aspect of these works. Language is used as a representation system, including experience without separating the realms of emotion and rational logical thought. Tanya Barson described Schendel's work as ludic linguistic games, or with the terms of Umberto Eco, as open works, designed to be completed by the spectator or reader, and therefore also understood as the relation of action and language. Temporality, the reception in different time levels, is an aspect of the work, makes the language a witness of experience in another time and transfers the experience in a new relation to the spectator. At the cultural communication practice, writing makes the significance of the said or written unstable and mutable. Mario Schenberg and Guy Brett, who met Mira Schendel in person, argue in the description of her work with the importance of the empty space and its equal status to the writings. The artist explains herself. It was an intriguing duality and fusion in the material base, and it seemed to follow naturally through the perception created in the spectator's imagination. The sensation that the empty space and the marking of or defining line were equal partners, inexchangeable and reciprocal energies creating one another. In this context, Guy Brett and Sonja Salstein evaluated the concept of the so-called void, a potential space as counterpart and dialectic negation of the integrated language, the dialectic of speaking and remaining silent. In this sense, we can compare Wittgenstein's philosophical position about the boundaries of language and the boundaries of the world as something mystical, inexpressible in words. Concepts presented by the artist, like the spatio-temporalidade, were compared with the thoughts of philosophers like Willem Flusser, Jean Gebser, and Henri Bergson. Marcel de Carvalho Borges sees in Willem Flusser's theories, for example, an important connection to Mira Schendel's thoughts and understanding of her work. Flusser's Lingua e Realidade was finished in 1963, exactly then when Mira Schendel started the experiments with the monotypias. Questions about the formal character of Schendel's work also leads to the positioning between visual arts and the concrete and neo-concrete poetry. Haroldo de Campos described the essence of concrete poetry with terms like words that act as autonomous objects or optical sound structures, and further, as tension of word things in space-time. As described previously, the position, dimension, and size of the writing constitute the reading in the sense of a phonetic structure, as seen in the examples Henri de Termes and Zeit. As Jazia Reichert pointed out, there's a connection between the works of Mira Schendel and the visual poetry, but she also pointed out that Mira Schendel's work can't be associated with any of the categories of the concrete poetry she defined. Jazia Reichert was a very interesting figure at the time. She, for example, held an exposition in 1965 which is called Between Poetry and Painting. Sorry. The organic line and gesture of writing in the Montgolfiers contrasts with the theory of strictly visual organization of the words in concrete poetry. Ferreira Goulard's neo-concrete poems have a debatable position between art and poetry, as Pauline pointed out yesterday too. The formal language is very similar to Schendel's works with Letraset in the late 1960s and 70s. Goulard's works, for example, the series Spatial Poems, are not poems in a classical term. The new media are objects, they are not print media anymore. There's no fluent text to read, but more, as Goya pointed out, a holistic poetic experience. In comparison with Schendel's work, the words cannot be seen separated from the object they are integrated in. As described by showing different work groups, Schendel's writings and letters cannot be reduced to its bare function to exchange information. The meaning remains transitional, opposite to a street sign, for example. These characteristics of Mira Schendel's work, David Medaya described at the beginning of a highly poetic future. This concept of transitional meaning also exists in linguistics, where poetic language is described in contrast to other forms of text. Due to some parallels to linguistics, I pointed out earlier, in this last abstract I want to introduce the term transmedial of a kind of transmedial poeticality and may be activated today for further discussion. Not only Mira Schendel worked with language in the 1960s in Brazil. Ligia Pape, Helio Chisica, Willy de Castro, Valdemar Cordero, and also Ferreira Goulard are just some examples. In the case of Mira Schendel, these artists made no use of dense text as well. In many cases, they are often just single words, phrases, or even letters or lines. Reflecting on these transmedial works, there emerged the question about possible phenomenological perspectives. The works show different modeling proportions between verbal and visual signs, emphasizing the physical structure or legibility. They are described as working alliances of epistemic and aesthetic function of language. In one possible reading of poeticality, lyrics are not just signifier, but complicate, on the contrary, the communication through layers of meaning. Poeticality describes literature in the status when meaning is undetermined and uncertain. Using the same uncertainty, Schendel constitutes propositions of meaning in her work in the liminal condition between signifier and signified. Now I want to come back to the tangled alphabets. Even if the exposition was disturbing at the first sight in bringing these two artists together, Schendel and Ferrari, there are some works of Leon Ferrari which seem to treat the same matter as Schendel. Even if Leon Ferrari's work is highly political, it's not the whole range of it which examines religion and politics. In fact, his works are in any case more impulsive in the gesture and expression than Schendel's Monotypias. But apart from that, they include many abstract paintings of lines on white paper with a clear reference to written language and handwriting without being legible. Like Schendel, Ferrari first started to work with language in the early 1960s. He began exploring the connection between word and line in the so-called written paintings, cuadros escritos, and dibujos escritos. And Leon Ferrari himself described on that matter, "I draw silent handwritten words which tell things with lines that recall voices, and I write drawings that recite memories that words cannot say." Thank you for that.